everybody. Welcome to the Buckeye Weekly Podcast. I am Tony Gerdeman, here as always with Tom Orr. Tom, how's it going?
Oh, I'm out of things to say this week. Tony, how's it going with you?
Thanks for joining us. Next.
There have been a lot of shows, and I think I'm out of emotions and independent thoughts at this point. So sorry, we're just going to have to talk football, not anything else. Let's start with the easy one, Tony. From @Isaac McIntyre, how did the Buckeyes win this game? Tony, they score more points. Next up.
All right, boom, number 2.
Yeah, boom. There's one. Yeah, I mean, how do they win this game? I mean, it's really trite to say they win the turnover battle, but I think they just need to, I don't think they need to win the turnover battle, but I think they need to not lose the turnover battle. You need to not give Michigan short fields. They need to play, disciplined on defense. If they don't give up big plays on defense, no plays over, no runs over 20 yards and no passes over 30 yards. And that's all I tell you. And Ohio State doesn't turn the ball over. What percentage chance? If that's all you know, what percentage chance are you giving Ohio State to win that game?
Oh, I'd put that around 65% or so. For me, whenever I think about this game and the years where Michigan didn't have that great of an offense, they would still find a way to concoct a big play, to draw up a big play. And if they're not able to do that one here, then yeah, I definitely like Ohio State's chances. I was just on a news station, Tom, on television, if you must know, and we're talking about running the ball to win the game. Do you see either of these teams, if you rush for less than 4 yards per carry, I feel like normally you won't win this game. But also, I could see both teams rushing for under 4 yards per carry in this game. Therefore, somebody must win.
Yeah, but if both teams rush for under 4 yards a carry, that means either you're getting a defensive score or a special team score or something like that maybe decides the game, or you got to win it with your passing attack. And if it's win it with your passing attack, I think I'm putting my money on Ohio State. Just Michigan's wide receivers are good. Colson Loveland is a very good tight end, but Marvin Harrison plays for Ohio State and Emeka Egbuka plays for Ohio State. And I don't know that J.J. McCarthy is meaningfully ahead of Kyle McCord right now. Both of those guys kind of dealing with some injury stuff. So, I think they're both maybe a little bit limited. McCarthy maybe a little bit more than McCord just because his injury is a little more recent. I think if Ohio State holds Michigan under 4 yards rushing and Ohio State doesn't turn the ball over, I think that's another one where I think I might even say greater than 65% chance of Ohio State winning that game if those are the only two things you tell me.
Yeah, because it does feel like Michigan will need to run the ball in this one because they have not been fantastic throwing the ball. And so if they're not able to run the ball, they put it all on J.J. McCarthy. And I'm pretty sure, as we said before, that we said maybe these exact same words last year heading into this game. Make J.J. McCarthy beat you. I'm not saying they need to do that this time. I'm just saying that if they're not able to run the ball, then things are going to get a lot more difficult for J.J. McCarthy. And he may still be able to do what he did, but he also had help last year with Donovan Edwards down in the fourth quarter making those big runs.
Yeah, and that was 3 long passes earlier in the games on 1 missed tackle and a couple busted coverages, and then 2 long runs at the very end of the game when Ohio State was kind of in desperation mode and you had just a couple bad run fits and you're playing cover 0, and then that turns what should be a 6-yard gain into a 65 or 75-yard gain. So I don't think I'm expecting Michigan to put up 5 big plays against Ohio State. Ohio State's only given up 1 play of 40 yards or more all season long. That was the fumble Ruski at Rutgers. So that took kind of a trick play to do it on a 4th and 1 situation. I don't think Michigan can bank on big plays again this year. So, if they can't run the ball, I think that's a big problem for them potentially. Next up from @0HST, so like OHST, but with a 0, Buckeye. If I told you Travion Henderson, Marv, or JT Tuimoloau had their best game as a Buckeye this week, which would you give me? Which would give you the most confidence in a Buckeye win? I'm going with Travion Henderson. That was the question. The listeners thought going with Travion Henderson. Although I think, Tony, that might also be my answer.
Tom, I think we might be 3 for 3 on that one because we've seen you can see a wide receiver catch 12 passes for 210 yards, and that's because of a desperation need to throw the ball because you're trailing by 3 touchdowns or whatever. So you can have a big game as a wide receiver and it not really impact the win-loss. Tom, I will also say we saw JT Tuimoloau have the game of his life last year against Penn State, and that was a game Ohio State needed 28 points in the fourth quarter to win that. So we saw an incredible game from JT Tuimoloau in that one, and yet you still needed much more to happen to win that game. So I think if you see Travion Henderson have the game of his life, then that to me is the one that you will take right now. And again, let's not forget the best game of Travion Henderson's Buckeye career was 277 yards rushing against Tulsa. So if we're going to use that measurement, then if Travion Henderson rushes for 278 yards, then you've got to like Ohio State's chances. But even if it's, Tom, what's the minimum number of rushing yards for Travion Henderson where you feel like that guarantees a win or 80% chance of winning? Is it like 160, 150 yards, somewhere in there? I mean,
yeah, somewhere in that like 175 range, give or take. If Travion Henderson runs for over 200 yards, unless you have like a 1999 Jonathan Wells situation where he runs for 76 yards and gets tackled at the 1 or whatever, and then they somehow get stuffed and miss a field goal. I mean, you have to assume you're running for 200 yards. You have to assume you're running for a couple touchdowns in there. So, okay, there's 14 points. And then if Travion Henderson's running for 200 yards, Michigan cannot let themselves get run over like that. So then you have to bring your safeties up. You've got to try and control the run. You got to try and get Ohio State, to do something else. And that's when then you involve, and that's when it maybe does turn into Marvin Harrison's greatest game as well. That's I think, the absolute best case scenario for Ohio State fans is Travion Henderson runs for 200-something yards, and then that opens things up. That's where Ohio State wins this by 4 touchdowns if Travion Henderson runs for 200 yards. I'm certainly not expecting that. If Blake Corum runs for 200 yards, Michigan's probably winning this game by 3 or 4 touchdowns. If Blake Corum and Travion Henderson both run for 200 yards, well, Tony, we will have watched a hell of a football game. I don't know anything more than that, but man, it will have been a hell of a football game.
Who is more likely to rush for 200 yards in this one? Because there's one running game that is trending up and another running game that is just trending, I don't want to say down, but it's not going up, and that would be Michigan. So if you're asking me, and I guess I'm the one asking me, if I'm asking me who is more likely to rush for 200 yards in this one, I'm going to choose Travion Henderson. We know that Michigan's run defense is pretty darn good, so rushing for 200 yards obviously isn't likely to happen. But the way he is playing right now, he has explosion. Blake Corum doesn't have the same thing that he had last year. And not that he would go 70 yards untouched, but he would go 45 yards and get tracked down. He'd go 52 yards and get tracked down. He's not doing that this year. Travion Henderson has more big plays than Blake Corum, and Henderson has missed 3 games, to give you an idea of the different levels of explosion. So I think if one of these guys is bound to do it, or if I'm picking one guy who could or would or over the other, I'm taking Henderson. Tom, would you take who's more likely to rush for 100 in this one?
I think more likely to rush for 100. I think I would probably say Corum, because I think if one of these guys is going to get 25 carries, it's going to be Corum. I don't think Travion Henderson's getting 25 carries. And, I'm not maybe you get a scenario where Travion Henderson runs, he has a 60-yarder, and then he also has 10 runs for 4.5 yards or whatever a carry, something like that. I could see that. I think your Travion Henderson, if he doesn't hit a long one, is probably not going to hit 100 yards. And I think there's a real possibility he doesn't hit a long one. So I think just in terms of Michigan is probably going to be more consistently willing to stick with the run, even if it's not really, really, really working. Like we have seen Ryan Day kind of get the itchy trigger finger a little bit sometimes where, okay, the run's not, the run's working and I know I have to stay with the run, but I'm just going to pass this one time and then kind of gets going on that. So I think more likely to run for 200 yards, Travion Henderson, more likely to run for 100 yards. I'm going to say Blake Corum. All right, next up, from Hank Scorpio, is this the biggest or most anticipated version of the game in history?
Tom, I think it's going to be incredibly difficult to beat the 2006 game, number 1 versus number 2. And that game was anticipated before Bo Schembechler's passing on Friday, made it even bigger. You've got the HBO film crew there doing a documentary about that game. Not that we necessarily knew it at that point, but there's just a lot going on that week, that game, and then it lived up to the hype. Although the score was closer than the game was down the stretch. It was 42-31 until Michigan scored at the end there and then got a 2-point conversion. So the 42-39 looks fantastic. Number 1 versus number 2. Everything lives up to the hype. How can this game? This is definitely still big. It's playoffs. It's division title, Tom. We can't lose that. I mean, the 2006 game was not for a division title. This is actually for something. And in fact, this is the opportunity to then go play Iowa. I mean, those are stakes, Tom, that the 2006 team has never played for. The 1969 team, the 68 team, they never got to play for these stakes. But everything going on around Michigan right now, what this game means for Ohio State, what this game means for Michigan, I would argue that the stakes of everything around the situation makes this bigger because there's just more going on right now.
Well, there's certainly more going on right now. I think you might fall into a little bit of an issue with this game not being in the spot on the schedule or with the proximity to the national championship that some of the past ones have had. The 1969 game predates both of us. But if Ohio State had won the 1969 game up in Ann Arbor, they're national champions, period, full stop, end of story. There was no additional game to win. There was not a championship game and a semifinal and a Big Ten championship game to win. It was if Ohio State wins in Ann Arbor, they are national champions for the second year in a row, because back then the Big Ten had what was called the no repeat rule, which meant if you went to the Rose Bowl the previous year, you could not go to the Rose Bowl again. So Ohio State had won the national championship in 1968. They had gone unbeaten into Ann Arbor in 1969. That was going to be their last game of the season, period, full stop, end of story. And if they had won, they were number 1 and they were going to win the national championship again. So that coupled with Bo Schembechler's first year, I'm sure that was a pretty hyped thing back then. I'm sure it was just blowing up Twitter in 1969.
Yes.
But it, so that's a sort of factor here that obviously predates us. It's really not one we're capable of discussing super intelligently. 1997, that was a really big one up in Ann Arbor. Ohio State, Michigan, both top 4. Ohio State had lost to Penn State earlier in the year, but that was it. Michigan unbeaten. That was a pretty hyped game. That got a lot of attention. That was a really good game. Michigan jumped out to a 20-0 lead. Ohio State came back. Michigan, boy, you look at the box score of that game. Michigan, I think, was like 42 rushes for 42 yards or something like that. Like, Michigan did nothing in that game. Ohio State turned it over a couple times. Charles Woodson runs back a punt, and that's all she wrote. And Michigan shared the national championship with Nebraska that year. 2002, that has to be in the conversation. That's another one where, 1997, that got Michigan into the Rose Bowl, and then winning the Rose Bowl got them a share of the national championship. 2002, the BCS had already started. So that win got Ohio State into the Fiesta Bowl, the national championship game against Miami. You can still remember probably Brent Musburger screaming about going to play for all the Tostitos. That one was another, really hyped game because that one is sort of similar narratively to this one where Michigan had that long run of dominance against Ohio State, 10-2-1 over a 13-year span. Jim Tressel goes up there in 2001 and upsets Michigan. And then 2002, it was, okay, is Ohio State going to continue this and make this a little bit of a trend, or is this going to be Michigan, gets things back on track as the world usually works? Plus, you had the BCS thing and the national championship on the line there. 2006, you talked about. 2016, that was a top 3 matchup that, went to overtime. And, I think some of these games, the 2006 game, 2016 game, suffer a little bit in memory based on what happened after those games. 2006, Michigan loses the Rose Bowl. After losing to Ohio State, they lose the Rose Bowl to USC. Ohio State loses the national championship game to Florida. 2016, Ohio State loses in the semifinal to Clemson. So I think, some of those games, looking back now, don't feel as big as they would have if those teams had advanced and won the national championships. It's not part of that kind of like a big picture kind of story. Last year, obviously, kind of the same thing. Not, didn't end up being that kind of a big picture story. So where this one falls historically might depend somewhat on what happens after the game.
Well, and what happens after the game is kind of why I think it is so important and could be really sea-changing for one program and altering the history for Ohio State perhaps as well, if they can go ahead and get this one, because the narratives that can then be latched onto as like a life preserver basically for the last couple of years. Whereas if Ohio State loses this one, then the thing that you wanted to latch onto, the counter Stallions thing over the past 2 years, like that's no longer, it's got some holes in it, and more than just the one that a life preserver may have. So there's some difficulty in just fitting that narrative into your own reality. But if Michigan loses this one, then this becomes, and we're already seeing the pre-backlash from some folks on the Michigan side saying that this is going to be the story that comes out of this. If Michigan loses, it's that the last 2 wins were tainted. Meanwhile, that is going to happen. That the thing is, you can't. This is why Michigan needs to win, because that is going to happen, and they can't prove that it's not true. And so there's just, people will run with it. People will. That's the label that Michigan's going to be given. So this is something that it's a big game, but it's bigger than just this game. And so that's why there's so much surrounding this, that there's the game, there's the legacies, there's the past 2 games, there's more than just this game. And by the way, this game is also extremely important. It's 2 versus 3, just like last year's was. But if Ohio State makes that kick against Georgia, that Michigan game last year doesn't mean nearly as much. And also, Tom, I think Marcus Hartman wrote about this week at Dayton Daily News, how this is going to be the last game like this for Ohio State and Michigan. And Ryan Day, somebody asked Ryan Day about that, not about Marcus's piece. I mean, come on, let's not pull up Marcus too much here, but asked him about the next games will be different because of the playoff, because it could be the first of 2 meetings, could be the first of 3 meetings. And he said it's not going to be any different, because everybody's going to want to win each of those games, no matter when they are, where they are, and who they are. You're never going to give your best, give anything other than your best in this game. So just a ton to go into this game. And yet for the people who are in each one, they're all the biggest, and nothing is bigger than the one you're in right now.
Well, I mean, Michigan talks about themselves as the 2-time defending Big Ten champions. They kind of feel like they are defending those last 2 Big Ten championships this weekend in a lot of ways. Because, if they lose, I mean, this is, it's sort of in a lot of people's minds. No one's mind is going to be changed. Everyone has already probably made up their minds in terms of what this game means, and it does or it doesn't mean anything about the previous 2 years. It does kind of, in a weird way, might impact sort of how severe this is viewed as. If Ohio State goes in and beats Michigan by 14, 17 points in a game where this is the best team that Michigan has had over the last 3 years. And Ohio State is, they're good in some areas and not as good in other areas. And it's on the road. And Michigan has won the last 2 by 3 scores. And if Ohio State goes in there and beats them by 2-3 scores, like, oh boy, that's not great for this year's team. But also, you can have Michigan people saying, well, this doesn't mean anything about the previous years. The vast majority of people are not going to agree with that sentiment. And if there is a widespread view that this, people at the NCAA are not going to necessarily agree with that sentiment. So if there is a widespread view that, hey, this materially impacted multiple years and potentially denied Ohio State teams a chance to play for a championship or swung the results of conference championships, that's not going to be good when you get to the punishment phase, if and when they get to the punishment phase with the NCAA. So when we say there's a lot on the line this weekend, we mean it. Real quickly, Tony, let's hit the last one from @Jimmy4602315131. What is the artillery shell sound at the Woody when you're doing shows from there?
Well, there are a number of sounds, and as I'm trying to think through my head, my first initial thought was that it was the Monarch machine, but I don't know that that's actually loud. I think it's the blocking sleds that some guys will be hitting at times. It's the softball going on against the wall and to get into the gloves. Is it anything? The chairs are being put away and thrown onto carts. Like, trust me, we've tried to complain about the noise of the athletes doing their things and the workers doing their jobs. Nobody wants to hear from us. So I apologize on behalf of them for doing their jobs in a loud manner, but it's not the Australians drag racing and doing donuts in the parking lot. That is a different noise.
No, that is a very different loud screeching noise. It is not the truck backing up to us, as we were talking about a former Ohio State offensive lineman and who did not have a particularly great performance at a pro day. This show has a long and storied history of, let's just call it sonic excellence, perhaps. Somehow we always find a way to, the tornado siren somehow always goes off. We can be recording at Tuesday at 2 p.m. It's like, why are they setting off the noon on Wednesday tornado sirens? How often is there a train going by wherever we're recording? Why are we constantly under flight paths of airplanes, no matter where we are recording from? How many Gators can Ohio State football possibly have in their facility? And the answer is, it doesn't matter. There is always something. I think my favorite was we were recording in late November, early December at one point in like a car outside the Woody. This is several years ago before we did these on a YouTube show. And there was someone either mowing or with a leaf blower. And it's like, it's December. There has not been a leaf or a piece of grass growing, a blade of grass growing in this area for 6 months. Like that was the one where I was like, all right, we are clearly on the Truman Show now. Like there's no other explanation.
Mine that sticks with me real quick is we recorded somewhere in the Bigs lobby, in the trophy lobby. Went to the side room where there was just like a strip of a carpet, a rug, and they decided at that point, as we were recording, you know what, let's vacuum this. And they brought in the vacuum. It's like, we came inside to get away from the outside noise, and then boom, time to do some housework. So that will do it for this episode. Again, please like this video if you have not yet done so. We would appreciate that. If you're listening to it on a podcast, go ahead and give us a 5-star rating and review. Find us at BuckeyeHuddle.com. Check us out. The game is just days away. I know we are all looking forward to it. And so that will do it for this episode. Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll talk to you guys later.